Hey everybody, it's Lon Seidman. We're taking a look today at the Synology RT6600AX router. This is a brand new router from Synology, and we've looked at a few of their other ones in the past. It has one of the best user interfaces for its control panel that you'll find out on the market. And we're going to be taking a closer look at this new version and see what it's all about in just a second. But I do want to let you know, in the interest of full disclosure, that this is on loan from Synology. So when we're done with this, it goes back to them. All the opinions you're about to hear are my own. No one is paying for this review, nor has anyone reviewed or approved what you're about to see before it was uploaded. So let's get into it now and see what this router is all about. Now, the price point on this one is around $300. The big difference between this router and the RT2600AC that came out a few years ago is that this one has support for Wi-Fi 6. And of course, it's got a little more hardware under the hood to handle faster internet connections. So if you were looking for better Wi-Fi performance, that would be one reason to consider this one over the prior model. One thing to note, though, is that all of the OS features that we're going to be looking at with this router will soon be on the previous version, the RT2600AC. So while that older router will never have Wi-Fi 6, some of the VLANs and some of the network configuration options that that router can't do, it will soon do, and those features are already built into the new one here. Now, as you can see, this one has a lot of antennas on board. That's because it is a tri-band router. It supports 2.4 gigahertz, and it has two 5 gigahertz radios on board. This will support Wi-Fi connections at 5.9 gigahertz, including the 160 megahertz wide connections. So it's conceivable that you can hit a gigabit over Wi-Fi with this device, provided conditions are correct and your laptop or whatever device you're using supports 160 megahertz connections. Nothing that I own at the moment does, but we will do a Wi-Fi test in a little bit. As always, though, you might want to consider getting some additional Wi-Fi access points around your house, because although the range is pretty decent on this, for the most part, it's not going to be any better than the router you're using now, given that most of these routers have a limited amount of power that they're able to transmit with. So if you have a portion of the house that isn't very good for Wi-Fi, this will likely not solve your problem, and you'll need to get some additional Wi-Fi access points. Oddly, at the moment, the only way to use this in a mesh scenario is to get another router and use that one as a mesh extender, and you can convert it into that with its control panel. Right now, the lower cost Synology mesh units do not work with this device, although I would expect that probably to change in the future. But at the moment, you're going to have to buy another one of these to go with a mesh environment. Now, as far as ports are concerned on this one, I'll give you my overhead view. Now, of course, you have your WAN input here, but you'll notice that on the LAN side, there is a WAN 2 option, and we saw this on the prior edition of the router as well. Now, you can have two internet connections attached, and should one fail, it'll roll over to the other one. Now, if you have a multi-gigabit connection, something greater than 1 gigabit, the router here on this port only supports a 2.5 gigabit connection. So you can get 2.5 gigabits in, but all of the other Ethernet ports here only do 1 gig out. So there is a limited amount of multi-gigabit support on here. And I was kind of surprised that they would go through the trouble of having one 2.5 gigabit port and not adding it to the rest of the LAN section here, but that's how they chose to do things. And again, if you have a fast enough Wi-Fi connection, you can probably get beyond a gigabit over Wi-Fi with the right set of hardware and conditions. Now, a little bit earlier, I did test its multi-gigabit routing capability. What we did is connected my network up to the WAN port at 2.5 gigabits, and then I connected two 1 gigabit devices to these two Ethernet ports. And then we had traffic route through the router out to some other computers on the other network, and we were able to sustain about a gigabit each running an iPerf test. So I think you will get pretty much the full speed of a 2 gigabit internet connection if that's what you have, but you can't go beyond 2.5. And again, the only 2.5 port on this device is that secondary WAN port. Now, on the back of the router, like we saw on the prior versions, there is a USB port, and what you can do with this is add a hard drive and turn this into a network attached storage device. It is not as fast as a real Synology NAS would be, but if you have small files that you just want to make available to your network, it can certainly get the job done for that. Additionally, you can use this to tether up a compatible smartphone or hotspot and have that work as your secondary internet connection should your regular ISP go down. And one last thing on the hardware side before we boot this up and start playing with it is that you do have a Wi-Fi kill switch here along with a WPS button for quickly pairing up with the Wi-Fi. So now what we're going to do is get this thing booted up and we'll run a quick Wi-Fi performance test on it, and then we'll poke around in its very interesting user interface. Let's get to that. All right, so we're on my brand new MacBook Pro 14, and again, this one does not support the 160 megahertz wide connection, but it does support an 80 megahertz wide connection, and as you can see, it's negotiated a connection rate of 1.2 gigabits per second. And I have a multi-gigabit connection here, so we are going to route through that 2.5 gigabit port. And let's see what we can pull down over the Wi-Fi here. And as you can see, we're getting pretty close to what you might experience on a gigabit Ethernet connection. We're just shy of 900 megabits on the downstream, and here on the upstream we're getting a very similar connection here. So if you are fairly close to the router with your device, you will get a ton of throughput here. And I think you can imagine the kinds of speeds you can get if you could double the bandwidth that your Wi-Fi is using from a radio frequency perspective. So there's a lot of performance packed into this. And if somebody was pushing down a gigabit over the Ethernet while you were hitting the Wi-Fi, both could maintain that gigabit speed as we were able to see earlier. But as I always like to point out when we're looking at router reviews, your mileage is going to vary greatly. Everyone's homes are constructed in different ways. You've got different things in the walls depending on when your home was built. If you're in an urban environment, there's going to be a lot more interference from other Wi-Fi routers. So much goes into a good Wi-Fi connection, which is why if you are trying to maintain a decent level of performance on the other side of your home, having additional wireless access points is the best way to ensure that. I can reach most of the rooms of my house, about 3,800 square feet, with this device, but as I get further away, those speeds decrease dramatically. All right, let's pop into its web-based control panel. Now, if you've ever used a Synology NAS or router, this will look very familiar, and they've got just an awesome interface here. Let's start off with the basics though, which is your network configuration. When you click on the Network Center, you get a good overview of what is connected to your router and how things are performing and whether or not your connection is up. You also have a lot of the basics here like port forwarding and triggering and all of the usual types of controls you would expect on a consumer-grade router. Now, one of the unique features of this router is that it supports VLANs. You can set up 5 distinct networks that can isolate from each other. Now, of course, VLANs are not a foolproof way of preventing networks from being penetrated, but it does keep out most casual users and a lot of scripts that might be looking for things on a local network. So for example, you can have your guests on one network, you can put your light bulbs and all of your IoT devices on another, and then have your kids on a third network, and none of those networks can see each other, but they can all share the internet connection. And you set those up here within the local network section here, and if I go and create a new network here, we can call this the test network. You can see that it gets its own IP address range here, and its DHCP server will assign IP addresses based on that range. And then I can enable network isolation so that this network can't see the others. And I can also prevent people from logging in to my Synology control panel here by leaving that checked off. I can also have an Ethernet port work on this network, or I can just set up a special Wi-Fi SSID for it, which is what we'll do here. So we'll call this Synology test, and I'll just do a simple password here and hit next, and I'll apply that, and after a few seconds we have another network set up that can allow people to connect via Wi-Fi but keep them isolated from the rest of the network. You can have up to 5 networks working at the same time, and if I go into my Wi-Fi thing here, you can see I've got a kids network, I have an IoT network, and I also have the Synology network that we just set up. Now, if your VLAN aspirations go beyond Wi-Fi, you can do things like VLAN tagging on the Ethernet ports and configure trunk ports. But when you've got that 2.5 gigabit connection installed, you really only have 3 Ethernet ports to play with on the router here. So I think if you're looking to do a lot more in the way of advanced networking, you probably want to go with something more robust like a UniFi system or something along those lines. But if you're mostly looking to isolate Wi-Fi users from each other and you want more than just one guest network, it's really nice to have this all built in. Now, this OS, which is SRM 1.3, will be coming to the prior model of this in a few months. So a lot of these features will carry over to the prior edition of this router that costs less. So if you don't need the Wi-Fi 6 and the 2.5 gigabit port, you'll get a lot of those features on the less expensive version of this router. Now, one of the things that I've always loved about the Synology routers is that they have a great VPN server built in. In fact, you can use a lot of different VPN technologies at the same time. Now, when I talk about VPNs in the context of this router, I'm referring to getting into your home network remotely and securely when you're off-site. And once you're in, you can gain access to everything that's on the other side of the router, but it's a more secure connection than just opening up ports and connecting directly over the internet. This is different than the services that my fellow YouTubers try to sell you all the time where you can pop out in some other part of the world. That's not what this type of VPN is. This is strictly accessing your local network securely when you are not at home. And you have a lot of different ways you can do it with one of these things. Now, Synology has their own VPN server technology called Synology VPN. They have client software available for most of the major platforms. That includes Mac, Windows, Linux, iOS, and Android. And this might be probably the easiest way to get going with a VPN on this. But if you would prefer to use an open source technology, they've got 4 options available for that, including OpenVPN and L2TP. And when you go in and set this up, you can actually determine which users use which type of VPN technology to log in. So you have a lot of flexibility here with a lot of choice as to how people can get access to the network. You can even do some crazy stuff with remote desktop, both RDP and VNC, that you can set up with specific URLs that you can give out to people. And it's certainly a lot more secure than just poking a hole in the router. Another neat option they have is WebVPN. This does not require any client software. And what it lets you do is gain access to web services that are on your local network but are not accessible to the rest of the internet. So for example, I have a NAS device in my closet over there running with a bunch of Docker containers. I can't access those over the internet, but if I log in through a VPN, I can get access to that local resource. And this is a really quick and easy way to get access to just those web-based services without having to go through the complexity of client software while still getting the benefits of a secure VPN connection. Now, if you have a Synology router at a different site, you can connect them with a site-to-site VPN connection. They do require you to register for a license, but at the time I'm recording this video, they don't charge you for that license. And this only works, unfortunately, with another Synology router. And of course, there are features like you'll find on other routers, including the ability to monitor what people do on your network. So for example, these are all the devices that are currently connected and what has been connected in the past. I can ban them outright. I can set custom speed limits for how much bandwidth they can consume at any given time. I can set devices for a higher priority. So all the things that you typically see on a consumer router are here, and I think the interface on this particular device is really top-notch compared to its competitors. Now, like other Synology devices, they have a little app store built into it called the Package Center. Now, on Synology NAS devices, there's a ton of stuff that you can install through this, but on this more single-purpose device, your choices are more limited. But I did install their Threat Protection, which is a deep packet inspection tool, and this will look for threats more aggressively than the firewall and drop things that it thinks are problematic. You do need to have a external hard drive installed for its database, and it will go out and see what's going on the network and decide whether or not certain events should be dropped. And I have a little utility that I use for file syncing called SyncThing, and it has a little NAT traversal thing that it does, and that was picked up by this, and those packets were dropped. And of course, you can override any of the things that it does decide to knock off the network. Now, outside of the deep packet inspection, you also have basic firewall controls, which you can access through the Network Center. This does not require additional storage, and I think for a lot of people will be enough to keep everything secure. They've got the default rules in here, of course, but you can set up rules specific for each of your VLANs if you want to route certain traffic through and not other types of traffic. Now, while we're on the topic of security, one thing I don't like about this router is that UPnP is enabled by default for the main network, and I would suggest turning that off. What UPnP does is it pokes holes in the router when devices on the network request that the router do it, and there's no user intervention in that. It just happens automatically, and that's really kind of dangerous to have enabled these days. So what you need to do right out of the gate is go to your primary network here, Network 1, click on the Edit button, go to Advanced, and uncheck UPnP and click OK. The good news is that the other networks that get created here when you make new ones all have UPnP disabled by default, but the main network has it on, and you should turn that off. Now, it's not great, though, as a file server. I think if you are just storing text files or something, that's fine. You can set up multiple users and give them different levels of access to the attached storage. I've got a file here that I created on my Mac a little bit earlier, just a text file that I was able to save on there through the native app. So it works kind of like a Synology NAS might. But it is not all that fast, as you'll see here with this Blackmagic disk speed test. So we're maybe getting about half a gigabit here connected over Ethernet, and I found that sometimes it just locks up when you place it under heavy load like this. So I would not rely on this for heavy-duty file storage. I would get a NAS for that, but you are able to keep a small number of files available to users on your network if that's all you need to do through the router here. And like other Synology devices, you've got the file station on here so you can browse files on its web-based control panel. I can even add files to it from my local Mac file system here just by dragging it over, and then other users can pull it off the drive through their file system or through the web here by clicking the download button. All right, one last thing to check on before we close out, and that is its app that you can use on iOS and Android to monitor and configure the router from your phone. Now, I have external access to this turned off at the moment, but if you VPN into the router, you could access this remotely. And it does a nice job of giving you a real-time look at your current bandwidth consumption. You can go over here to devices and see who is consuming the most bandwidth and do things like block them or prioritize them or whatever else you want to do, similar to how you could do it on the web interface. And you also have access to a bunch of the configuration options here via the app. And sometimes it's just faster to get into it with your phone versus having to go find a computer to log into. So overall, I found this to be another solid and very robust consumer router from Synology. I'm still using the prior edition on my network here to run all of my IoT devices, and it's been rock solid for 2+ years. And I'm looking forward to the firmware update that Synology says is coming to the old router that will add some of those VLAN features we looked at earlier. My big gripe with this new router, though, has to do with the Ethernet. I would have loved to have seen 8 ports versus 4. And I was kind of puzzled by the fact that there's only one 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port on here. And there are now more and more ISPs offering multi-gigabit service here in the US and in other parts of the world. And if you are lucky enough to have one of those connections, none of your devices will be able to make full use of it because the only port that will take that 2 gig is this one, and the rest of them will be limited to just 1 gigabit. And I think it would have been nice to have all 4 of these at a minimum support 2.5 gigabits so one of your devices could make full use of the connection if it needed to. But it was good to see that it supports some of the newer Wi-Fi 6 technologies that can go north of a gigabit if your client device can support that. although I would have liked to have seen a more affordable meshing option beyond just buying a second unit to act as a mesh point. So hopefully Synology will have some more products to accompany this one in the months ahead. But if you are a single router household with just a single access point and maybe upgrading to a gigabit connection, I think this will be more than adequate for that. You've got a great interface and a ton of features that I think really set these routers apart from others in the consumer space. That is going to do it for now. Until next time, this is Lon Seidman. Thanks for watching.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters Chris Allegretta, Brian Parker, Hot Sauce and Video Games, Baby Metal Fox God, Tom Albrecht, Amda Brown, Matt Zagaya, and Tech Time with Eric. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to lon.tv/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit lon.tv/s.